Sorry. Well, that's a good introduction anyway. I can remember many years ago, being at Google it was, and the lady decided to introduce me, and she said, of course, Keith Laybourn is the most promiscuous author, when I actually thought she meant prolific. But the killer came later, because it was about sex, population, and leisurely needs raw years. And when she finished, she said, "Oh, there's a lot of autobiographical stuff in there, isn't there? You ought to write your autobiography." I said, "Well, you never do that until you're about to die." "Well, I hope it's soon then," she said. So we've got, sort of good moments there. What I want to do today is to talk about the Labour government of 24. Now, sorry, I'm told not to move. Anyway, I'm a walker, which is a difficulty. But basically, 1924, obviously, the first Labour government came in on the 22nd of January. And of course, that was a shock to the world. And of course, this year is the anniversary. So I think I've given 2 lectures on that. And I think I've got one next January. But really, in a sense, I mean, that was the most significant government. And really, in a sense, set a new pattern. So what I want to talk about is that government, the people, the issues, and examine basically, I suppose, why did it come into existence? What did it achieve? How did it? What did it do in office? How did it fall from office? And what was its significance? So really, in a sense, it's those sort of things. Let me start off. Are we going dimmer here?
Yes.
Nice. Oh. On leaving Whitehall on the 21st of January, 1924, we're right. Thomas Jones, who was the Assistant Cabinet Secretary. Later on, he was Cabinet Secretary and so forth. But saw a newspaper stand. And on that newspaper stand, there were 2 headlines. Basically, Lenin dead, official. MacDonald Premier. Now, it's an unfortunate juxtaposition, but in a sense, it was almost the history, in some respects, of the first Labour government. What happened is that really the 2 issues came together, and the Labour government of 24 is blighted by the fact of Soviet treaties, Campbell case, Zinoviev Letter, etc. That probably brought it down. But what happened is that quite clearly within what had happened, and I'll outline it very quickly, is that in 1923, December 1923, the general election threw up an inconclusive situation. The Conservative government that had gone had got 258 MPs, Labour had 191, and the Liberals had 150. And the result of that was that, the Conservative Party tried to go on. But Labour, in the end, was brought in because the Liberals wouldn't support them. And what we've got in the history of this government...
See if that works.
Oh,
no, it's flashing red.
Sorry. In the history of this government is a short government that lasted 9 months, fell from office at the end of October 1924. It had lasted 9 months and 1 week. And we got the return of a Conservative government. So it was against the trend, perhaps. Now, as I said, what I want to do today is to look at why it came into existence, what it did, which is relatively little, why it fell from power, and the significance of its action. And it's particularly the significance of the action that, or its fall from power, that actually attracts a lot of interest. Because was it Stanley Baldwin and the Conservatives wanted to get rid, joining the Liberals and getting rid of the government? Or was it MacDonald, as some people say, being so successful, as we shall see, and therefore the Liberals and Conservatives want to get rid of them? Or was it, MacDonald's incompetence, etc., etc.? There's all sorts of sort of arguments about that. Now, let's go on to the formation of the government itself. I don't think any assessment of the fact the first Labour government came to office can be actually made without realising what the Labour Party, what the Labour Party was. Yeah, keep telling me back here. I'm sorry, it's not natural for me. You've got to remember the situation. The Labour Party as a political party had emerged in 1900 as the Labour Representation Committee. It became in 1906 the Labour Party. And it wasn't terribly successful to begin with. It won 29 MPs in the 1906 general election. It gathered support from the miners and other groups in 1909, so it had 50 MPs. Up to the war, basically, it had about 50 MPs in a House of Commons of 650. It was there. It was seen as more supportive of the Liberal Party. But basically, it's... Well, look at it. Does that mean I can walk up and down?
It might do.
Oh.
Try it and see.
Okay. Well, I'll walk up and down because that's my natural instinct, I'm afraid. But basically, what it meant is in 1918 it was, a minority party. In the First World War, it had actually benefited by the fact that it was actually in the coalition government, the wartime coalition. So, the very fact that some of its leaders were recognised as national figures was important. But in 1918, it didn't terribly well, on 50 odd MPs. So it's not anywhere near political power. But in the war, at the end of the war, two events occurred. One is in 1918, the electoral franchise was widened. The Franchise Act increased the electorate from 7 millions to 21 millions. Women over 30, in most circumstances, and men over 21, or men over 21. And suddenly, the political scene changes. It's not really just a group of rather rich people running the country. The electorate has to be dealt with. And the Labour Party obviously is going to do well out of this. Because people who would have voted for it now have the votes. And secondly, in 1918, the Labour Party introduced a new constitution. For the first time, it became a socialist party because it had clause 4. And looking around the room, there are quite a few of you might be able to remember clause 4. Off by heart, perhaps. Well, you certainly won't remember the clause 4 of 1994-5, will you? But anyway, because that's 250 words. So really, in a sense, the Labour Party became viable. And what it did between 1918 and 22 was to build up its structure. Instead of 200 constituency parties, it had 595 within 4 years. It had agents. It even had policies. Secondary education for all, which I'll refer to later on, was actually RH Tory, it's the Labour Party policy, and it's the idea of universalism in education. Its policies were beginning to come through. It even talked about public ownership, although it never had a policy on that until 1937. So things began to develop. And the result was in 1922, Labour became the official opposition. 150 odd MPs, the result of which is that it outran the Liberals and therefore was the official opposition. So it's not entirely surprising that Labour could have actually formed a government. But what happened? In 1923, the economy wasn't doing well. Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative Prime Minister, said, I must have weapons to deal with the protective policies of other countries, and went to the nation on the issue of protectionism. Now, that was alien to what we'd had for 60 years. From the 1860s to the 1920s, Britain had been a free trade and gold standard country. So free trade was the issue. The Liberal Party didn't accept that. The Labour Party was free trade. The Conservative Party was now protectionist. But it didn't get a majority. And it's at that moment in 1923, in December the 6th, 1923, that suddenly it is obvious that, in fact, the Liberals are not going to support the Conservatives. Stanley Baldwin spent 6 weeks trying to run the economy, but then gets defeated. I've actually got the sort of Times description here of that time, which talks in very grave senses about It is not a moment of elation. There's a terrible responsibility now being given to inexperienced people. That's the gist of what comes in. But the Labour Party, after 6 weeks, when Asquith said, the Liberal Party, I won't raise a finger to help them, and the Conservative Party, the Labour Party came into power. So that's the sort of setting. So quite clearly,
Mike's not working.
it's not.
Sorry.
So quite clearly, it's a matter. So I've got to stand here.
Yeah.
So quite clearly, it's brought in on the behest of the Liberals, and it's a minority government. It's not even the largest minority party. So it's unusual circumstances that occurred. And the result of that was there's a tremendous shock throughout the country. Remember, every countess seemed to be worried that her pearls would be dragged from her cut throat. There's comments, which I hope are on the board here, about basically, Lord Haldane, I think it was women who had stocks in the cities wanted him to save the country from socialism. Sir, I don't have to put it down there, but Sir Frederick Banbury, MP of the City of London, for the City of London, said he would lead a column of Coldstream Guards into Parliament to protect the Constitution. So there's a sort of threat there. And of course, I think I put it on there. Famously, of course, I think you need to be on the next one. Sorry, am I doing it? I heard you was doing what here. A minute. That's right. Sorry, Lord Haldane, the city is in a panic and thought of a Labour government. Old ladies are writing to their brokers to save their money from confiscation. Baldwin wrote to Haldane to help Labour out. King George V wrote in his diary today, as you can see, 23 years ago, Grandmama died. Grandmama, of course, is Victoria. I wonder what she would have thought of a Labour government. What a thought. But David Lloyd George and some Liberals said, well, they've done the right thing. A socialist government, not actually, I think he said, in power. He was in office, but it wasn't in power. What a better time to have them in power. Well, they have no power. They're in office, not in power. And really, in a sense, that's what the sort of situation was. Quite clearly, as I've suggested already, that the party was turned on issues of free trade, etc., etc. But what I would also stress is that, in fact, it represented not just this threat, but also the worry that, in fact, it was a completely different type of cabinet. You just think about it. In the Conservative cabinet of 1923, there were 6 Etonians, 5 Harrovians, and most of the rest had gone to public school. Sounds a bit like a certain Mr. Cameron's government recently, when I think 2/3 were public school, in 2015 or something like that. So, there's that. Now you look at the Labour government, and the new one, and if I could read it in this darkness, I'll do my best here. Amid the gold, and this is when the Labour cabinet went to see went to be sort of sworn in effectively, went to see the king. Amid the gold and crimson of the palace, I could not help marveling. This is J.R. Clines, who was J.R. Clines, who was the deputy Labour leader. J.R. Clines, I'll show you a picture of him later on. J.R. Clines said, amid the gold and crimson of the palace, I could not help marvelling at the strange turn of fortune wheel, which had brought MacDonald, the starving clerk, Thomas, J.H. Thomas, the engine driver, Henderson, Arthur Henderson, the foundry worker at Laybourn, and Clines, the mill hand, to this pinnacle. And in fact, Philip Snowden, who you'll see in a few minutes, Chancellor Exchequer said, well, we never believed that this day would actually arise. So it was such a shock. And I think you've got to think about that. And on top of it, although I'll come back to it, so you've got the shock of the Labour government, you've got the shock of the change of cabinet, but you've got to remember you're in the context also of a fear of communism. I never realised until I looked at some of the archives connected with the David Lloyd George coalition government of 1918 to 22, why there was so much fear on communism. Well, that there was so much fear. In 1919, there was a police strike, 2 police strikes actually, 1918 and 1919. There was a fear of revolution as a result of what had happened in Russia, the 2 revolutions. And on top of that, there is a real concern that there's going to be a revolutionary change in Britain. So what do? I couldn't believe it when I saw this, but they said, well, if there's a revolution, the socialists will take over the telephone exchanges. So how do we communicate? So if you look at the National Archive material there, they arranged for the RAF to fly in planes to race courses, Cheltenham, York, whatever, and that they would give bikes out, motorbikes out to the police, so the police could come and get their orders from these race courses. It's tremendously developed sense, and there's a fear that this is going to actually occur, because it never does occur. So really, in a sense, that's the environment in which the Labour Party emerges, or at least the Labour government, the first Labour government emerges. But from the start, I've got to say that, in fact, the Labour government began a moving on. So it's unusual circumstances, but what happens is that the Labour government, when or before it becomes in office, actually is committed to actually playing down the significance of socialism. It becomes moderate in its policies, even before it forms a government in January the 22nd. It's already dropped some of the policies that were being put forward. Philip Snowden put forward a policy, Chancellor Exchequer later on, of capital levy. Everybody over £5,000 of income per year, wealth per year, will pay 1% in tax. Rising to, if you get 20 or 30,000, it was never fully defined, they'll be paying 50% of their wealth. Now that's a great fear. Now that was dropped and never mentioned again. MacDonald also ensured that some of the left-wingers in the Labour movement didn't get into the cabinet. His shadow cabinet waiting for office was not good. So, for instance, George Lansbury, you couldn't trust George Lansbury? The grandfather of Angela Lansbury. He had 8 children. 6 or 7 of them were communists. You're not going to have him in the cabinet. He later, in the 30s, of course, became a Labour leader. In addition to which, what's happening is that, in fact, he begins to develop policies with them on the 12th of December, 6 days after the election. He meets with Beatrice Webb, Sidney Webb, Philip Snowden, Jimmy Thomas, Arthur Henderson, Clines, and decides on the policies of the Labour government. There'd be moderate policies on education, there'd be moderate policies connected with housing, etc. So really, in a sense, it was going to be moderation. And in addition to that, with that moderation, there was moderate policies were presented to the TUC and to the Labour Party, and they accepted and endorsed them. And you can see even before the 12th, early January, I should say, these policies are put forward at a Labour victory. Remember, the Labour victory rallies before Labour comes into office, 2 weeks before it comes into office. And I put a little bit of it down there, but there's a speech by MacDonald, and a chap called Massingham, a journalist, wrote it up. Mr. MacDonald has come to say a difficult word to an idealistic audience. The word was moderation. The efforts of the Labour Ministry to establish itself as a governing force will be made clear establish a new concordat of peace based upon immediate recognition of Russia and an attempt to bring Germany back into the European system. And it would make an offer with capital to engage with its great scheme of productive employment. Impatient idealism may have revolted, and had it done so, the life of the Labour government, if it ever began, would have dwindled in a short and inglorious episode. But the response was perfect. The enthusiasm of the meeting was restrained and enhanced. It was clear that new government being itself, basing itself not on a class war, but on cooperation or cooperative activity, and even the religious instincts of the whole nation. And it would be a wonderful moment. So basically what they're saying is he's trying to offer the Labour Party, or the new Labour government when it comes into power, as a party that will be moderate, that will indicate its ability to actually control government and indeed be responsible government. I think that's basically what it's about. Now, what I want to suggest, of course, is that once in office, the Labour government, I suppose, basically didn't do a right lot, but there were some highlights of activity. The first one, I suppose, I'll refer to here is education. What it decided to do, you've got to remember that the Labour government had a policy which had emerged through Bradford, through the Bradford Charter, to the Labour Party Education Charter in 1917, which said basically that all children should have the same opportunities in education. You know, working class kids went to elementary schools. They didn't go to secondary schools or grammar schools or whatever. And so really, in a sense, what's happening is that the Labour Party wants to offer what became, in 1922, secondary education for all, R.H. Tawney. And R.H. Tawney said that universalism is what we're aiming for. The Labour government was trying to aim for that. Many of you will remember, because you're probably my age or going on my age anyway, I think you're probably the oldest here, but anyway, not to worry, that in fact Labour set up Haddow. Haddow report in 1926, reporting afterwards, actually what it suggested was a tripartite system of education. It wasn't universal. You could go to secondary modern, you could go to central or technical schools, or you could go to grammar school, based upon the 11 plus. Did anybody take the 11 plus like I did? Hey, we know what. Well, that is not universalism. It's often described as Labour policy. It isn't Labour policy. Labour policy was comprehensive. But what Labour tried to do, and it was C.P. Trevelyan, who was the brother of G.M. Trevelyan, the famous historian, an MP for Ellen, a Liberal who joined the Labour Party. He aimed to raise the schooling age to 15. He aimed to try to introduce secondary education, but they did nothing. Basically, 15, raising the school leaving age to 15. When did that happen?
1944.
Exactly, 1944. Labour Party put it forward, we're going to do it. It got delayed or got stopped because it collapsed, the first Labour government. 1936, there's an Education Act which says it will be raised to 15 as of September the 1st, 1939. Rather an unfortunate date. Because obviously we're on the eve of the Second World War. So Labour tried to do this, but it did improve the size of classes, took the size down. But in education, all the bluster amounted to basically extending the number of working class kids or local authority kids who could go to grammar schools. In 1902, the Conservatives introduced a bill which created a situation where grammar schools could get money from the rates. In 1907, the Liberals said if they're going to get money from the rates, they have to take kids in from the school board, so the local government by that time. 25%. Well, Labour, all they did was raise it from 25 to 40% of the pupils must come from the local authorities. You know, they could get a lot of money, could grammar schools, or from from the authorities, so they had to make work. That's the only thing that. Are you falling off there?
No,
It's about the only thing that they actually managed to achieve. Now, if you think about it, all that is extending the educational ladder out of the working class. You know, there are Labour MPs who said, I want to rise with my class, not out of my class. There was a lot of frustration about it. Didn't do a right lot. The second thing is housing. Wheatley Act. Now, John Wheatley, let me show you some of the characters. Here's the, I don't know if it's clear enough really, but the Labour government there, this is the Labour government. Most of them are working class. You've got McDonald here, you've got Kleins at the side of it, you've got Jimmy Thomas, the traitor of 1926. My father hated him. He said, man, I left the Labour movement down, around. At the back there, right at the top there is John Wheatley. Side of him is Fred Jowett, Sidney Webb, the famous writer, man who set up London School of Economics and so forth. We've got Philip Snowden there, etc. Wheatley at the top there. What Wheatley did, he was a Glaswegian, and what he did was to, he was interested in health and housing, and that's the office he was given. In 1923, the Neville Chairman had set up an act to give money to private building firms to build houses. Wheatley said that's not much use for the working class who rent. So in 1924, he introduced the Wheatley Act, which provided £9 per house for 40 years to council houses that were being built. And £12, that's urban areas, £12, 10 shillings in the rural areas. And that led to a lot of house building up to 1934 when the Act was finished. When I taught at Open University, a few university courses, I used to have housing officers who in the 70s were still gathering their £9 for 3,000 houses for their local authority. And still, now, the other thing I should actually point out is that I was raised for my first year of my life in a Wheatley house, the first trench of basically of council houses as such. So not a right lot happened, except that I suppose that's the most important. But when he announced it on the 26th of March 1924, he stated, this is Wheatley, I wish this country was ready to receive a socialist program, and we would show you how much easier it would be to solve this problem than trying to patch up the capitalist system. This is not socialism, he said. Thirdly, economic thinking was impeccably orthodox. Philip Snowden, I don't know if anybody knows much about Snowden, but Snowden was born near Keighley. In his early days, he was suffering with neck size and then suffered illness. And in 1895, he joined the Labour Party and became one of the leading figures. And he's impeccably orthodox in his economics. He's brought up as a Gladstonian liberal. His economic thinking is basically balance your budgets. That's basically what he's about. Socialism will come out of a surplus. That's one of his great quotes. And really, in a sense, the problem is that, in fact, because of that, unless there was a surplus, this Labour government couldn't do anything. They were actually lucky he had a £40 million surplus. So he introduced in 1924, his housewife's budget. Half that money was spent on reducing the sugar tax. So 20 million on the sugar tax. And it was called the housewife's budget in comparison to the money that was given to the businessmen in 1923, the big business budget. So really, in a sense, that's basically what he did. But he didn't do anything else, really. One of the things that is problematic in the 20s is unemployment. It's risen to 1 million. It worsens in the early 30s, but it's risen to 1 million. And remember, unemployment statistics, they do not believe them because they are people who, in a sense, are almost qualified. There's lots of people here, they're not going to qualify for unemployment. They're not on the statistics. And so it's a great underestimate. But what happened is that, in fact, Labour tried their best to deal with unemployment, but they didn't really have a solution. And they came to the viewpoint that unemployment's inevitable under capitalism. Only under socialism will unemployment disappear. So it's palliatives that they became involved in. And Snowden didn't finance more than a few public work schemes. And the only other thing it did is extend the amount of, there's two types of insurance. There's ones for people who work, and when you run out of work, there's the dole. And what he did was to extend the number of weeks that people could claim insurance benefits from 26 to 41 weeks, but that was it. So really, in a sense, the policy is very disappointing. Partly because this is Churchill saying about Snowden, the Treasury mind and Snowden meet like two long lost kindred lizards. And with that, here we are, it's there. Embrace each other like two long lost kindred lizards. And Bob Boothby made a similar sort of point. Now, I don't know if anybody remembers Bob Boothby, but anybody? Yeah, oh God. I mean, very famous man because he's a close friend to Macmillan and other conservatives. I think, wasn't he the cuckold? Yeah, all right. He was a friend of the Craze. He set up the Brains Trust on television in the 50s and 60s. You remember the Brains Trust? He was involved in that. That's a political debating program and whatever. And at the age of 85, I think he married a young lady of 20 and it lasted about 6 months, wasn't it? That was did he last that long?
4 to 6 months at least.
Something like that. But basically, he said the same. Very basic outward should be economy, free trade, and gold. These were the keynotes of his political philosophy. Inflation that he stood with almost ghoulish enthusiasm. So really, in a sense, there's nothing there. There's a discussion about nationalisation. Labour's never going to do anything on nationalisation. It was a convenient, unifying weapon in 1918 to bring lots of socialists together. They never did anything. They didn't do anything until the Attlee years and so forth. So it's not tremendously sort of effective or whatever. Unemployment, therefore, I've got it there. There were a few things on electrification. One thing I forgot to put down there, at least they did one thing, and they started the national grid. That was the first time the national grid was formed. But by and large, their moderate domestic policies, when they tried some of the other policies, agricultural reform and all sorts of things, were beaten. And Labour is frequently beaten. Most governments are. It's beaten 11 times on domestic issues. The last two, the 12 and 13, becomes a problem for the Labour government. None of that, as I put there, is likely to shape the fabric of, of society. Now, in foreign policy, there was a little bit of success because James Ramsay MacDonald. Again, you know about MacDonald? Does anybody? No? Ramsay MacDonald, who eventually, because I was raised as a Labour man in a mining community of Barnsley, and when the first time I joined the Labour Party, somebody said, I hope there's going to be no MacDonaldism here. Because in 1931, he ditched the second Labour government and formed a national government. And so you could see the sort of reaction to him. He suspected, even at this stage, that MacDonald had one. Well, I mean, there's a very famous quote about him. Was it in 31 when he left? And that is, "Here lies the body of Ramsay Mac, a friend of all humanity. Too many pats upon the back inflated Ramsay's vanity. The blarney stony oft time kissed, but having been born a socialist, he died a bloody Tory." And really, the sense that is how people probably viewed him, even at this stage, because the Labour government's failure, the first Labour government's failure, gets a lot of stick from the left in Britain. Now, MacDonald, before the war, and being effectively the Labour leader, resigned in 1914 because he opposed the war. He wasn't a pacifist, because he His meetings were often defended by people with knobkerries fighting off those attacking him. But he was convinced that the real problem in post-war years was the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles set up a system of reparation. Germany had to pay in reparations, often in kind, coal and other things. And the real problem with that is that they failed to deliver. And the result was that in one case, for instance, the French moved into the Ruhr in 1923. And MacDonald saw real dangers that this might actually lead to another world war in time. So he was committed to bringing Germany back into the fold, to dealing with the reparations issue, and trying to ensure collective security of Europe for the next, for the next generation. So he called an inter-allied conference. He had to deal with the issue of getting the French out of the Ruhr. He introduced, or tried to introduce, the Dawes scheme for reducing reparations. And by and large, by ensuring the French protection against the future German invasion, collective security, he got the Geneva Protocol accepted, and it was probably his finest hour. It looked as though Britain was leading the world, or leading Europe, in trying to deal with the issue of impending war or threatened war. But really, in a sense, all that was undone by the Conservatives at Locarno in 1925. But that was probably it. So really, in a sense, we first of all got a situation where the government, although the government sounded unusually in power. Secondly, that in fact, when it was in power, it was in office rather than in power. It really didn't do a great deal. And the real problem that the Labour government faced and dominated what it was doing was the association, in a sense, with communism. MacDonald had said that, and I've already quoted it here, he said that what we must do is bring the Soviet Union back into the fold. And it's part of the Labour Party manifesto. It's what he's stated on several occasions. And the first thing he does is basically to try to do so. Now, it's quite clear, and Thomas Jones, again, the cabinet among the assistant cabinet secretary, met some of the Labour people, and he said, well, we've got all these fears of communism, strikes and whatever. But he met John Wheatley. It's pale pink rather than turkey red. I like that sort of reference to it. Because of it, but still he was dangerous because of his attitude to the Soviet Union. Now, 3 or 4 things dominated the rest of the Labour government's short period in office. Anglo-Soviet treaties, which is the attempt of MacDonald to get treaties organised with the Russians. The Campbell case, which sort of runs parallel to it for the latter months of the Labour government. And finally, during the election, the Zinoviev Letter, the red letter scare. And I think if you look at those, you'll find that the Labour government, most of its time is occupied in dealing with those particular issues. The Anglo-Soviet Treaties is pretty obvious. It's the Campbell case is a case of an open letter in 20th of July 1924 asking soldiers not to fire upon workers. And the third one, of course, is the occasion itself. Now, the fall of the Labour government itself is rather serpentine in its trajectory, one might say. Some people look at these events and say that's the reason for its fall, the reasons for the failure. Beatrice Webb, if you've ever come across her, you should read her diaries. If you want somebody who's going to make acid comments about you, it's her. And I mean, her famous comments about MacDonald is as a magnificent substitute for a leader, which is not bad. She met some dockers in London during the dock strike of 1889 and 90. She said they were a thick set of people, but their wives seemed to be intelligent. She's not restrained in her comments, but this is her view on, and really in a sense, the other phrase from her got is the elusive mystery of MacDonald's leadership. She blames MacDonald in the things, and you'll have to judge as I go through it. J.R. Klein, you've seen him already, argues that in fact it's not so much the problems of Russia and whatever, it's that MacDonald was being successful, he was doing things too well, and the Labour government might last forever. And even David Lloyd George, until the Russia issue became very important, believed that the Labour government could have gone on for 2 or 3 years and worked with the Liberals and things could have been improved, etc., etc. ILP critics, Independent Labour Party critics, were not so enamoured. The people like Jimmy Maxton and Wheatley and that were very critical of the Labour government. In fact, when MacDonald became leader anyway in 1922 of the Labour Party again, Maxton was the leading opponent to MacDonald's return as leader of the Labour Party and hence ultimately the Labour government. So really, in a sense, we've got a number of factors. Is it these events or is it other factors? And you can mix them up. I mean, I've got to say quite clearly that I think Lord Beaverbrook right, the Conservatives and Liberals wanted him out, but that was it. Now, quite clearly, let's start looking at some of these events. I'll not say too much about them, but quite clearly, as soon as Labour came into office, it was trying to work arrangements with the Russians to bring the Russians back into the fold, to create a trade treaty with them. There were lots of problems, mainly compensation for British bondholders. In the Russian revolutions, of course, British bondholders have lost property and whatever. And there's an Anglo-Russian bondholding group who are pressuring the government to deal with. And the Conservatives want, and even Liberals want compensation. So that's a big issue, that's a problem. And it has to be partly resolved before the next issue can be, and that is to raise money, £30 million, for the Russians, 2/3 of which will be spent upon British goods. And so that's what's happening in the early months of the Labour government. There was supposed to be an agreement that within 21 days, this would be put forward in May, I think it was, to the House of Commons. Now, anybody knows anything about parliamentary politics, it does not move. It moves at a glacial pace. 21 days was never going to be enough to get this sort of material agreed by the British Parliament. You wouldn't have gone through the committees and everything else fast enough. And so that's an issue that rumbles on throughout the summer of 1926, and reappears in September and October in 1926 towards the end of the Labour government. You'll find that the person who's substantially sort of opposed to this is not Mr. Asquith, although Asquith doesn't want issues to be taken over too seriously there. But what David Lloyd George is the real critic of the Labour government, and he and the Liberals produce pamphlets in Darkest Russia, the Sham Treaty, articles in the Daily Chronicle in Darkest Russia, and Labour tries to defend this, but it's quite clear that in fact the Russian treaties is not going to get accepted. The Liberals and the Conservatives are coming together, and by the end of September, October, MacDonald himself thinks that in fact this is going to bring down the government. But he says, bring it on, lads. Let's have a fight. If you want to take us to election, we'll take it to election, because it was one of his basic principles that he was putting forward. So there's that sort of situation. Now, I could go on with that, but that's sort of the background, in a sense, of what was happening later on. We continue with the same thing in the Times, Asquith denouncing the treaties as crude experiments in nursery diplomacy. And I've got the quote there, I am inclined to give the Liberals an election if they force it. if anybody did bother after the election, it was the Liberals, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. The second issue, which I made, so that's going on, and it looks as though it's going to bring Labour down. In fact, on the 8th of October, they get defeated in the Commons on that issue. The second, our number is up. Here we are. I've got quotes from Labour, Sidney Webb, and others saying the same sort of thing, you know. And this is where Beatrice Webb comes back and says, you know, poor old MacDonald, he doesn't know what he's doing. John Wheatley says, you know, you can't listen to MacDonald in Parliament, even when he's telling the truth, expecting him not to be telling a lie. This is sort of no confidence in him. But the second thing is the Campbell case. Now, the Campbell case with J.R. Campbell, communist. He was assistant editor of the Workers' Weekly, the communist paper, the Workers' Weekly of the 20s. Its editor was Rajani Palm Dutt. But it was the paper of he was the deputy. What's happened is that they produced an article. And the article, if I can find the actual title, so I'm trying to see this, I can't see. Oh, here we are. Published on the 25th of July, it was called An Open Letter. Somewhere, sorry, I can't see in the darkness here, but the actual title, it's called The Open Letter anyway. And it was a plea to British soldiers not to shoot fellow workers, citing previous examples of them firing upon workers and noting how the first Labour government had threatened to use naval men in dock strikes, etc. So, you know, they're anti-Labour. J.R. Campbell hammered home the key's message. Let it be known that neither in class war nor in military war will you turn your guns on your fellow workers. So that's produced on the 25th of July, 1924. Well, this is noticed by Sir Frederick Hall, a Conservative. It's brought to the attention of the government. And what happens is that the police are sent in, or special branch, I should say, are sent in to deal with to arrest the editor. But the editor wasn't there. Johnny Palm Dutt was away. He was ill, or in Europe, because he was in charge up from Amsterdam of the Western Gathering Information Force of the Soviet Union, the Western Bureau. And what happened is that, in fact, they had Campbell there. Now, they didn't know what to do. They didn't have a warrant for Campbell. So they went and spent 2 hours, 6 officers there going around. They arrest Campbell eventually. But then there's a problem. Campbell is a war hero. He's got war medals. He was in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. And he'd had part of his feet not blown off. In fact, he had no toes. You know, he got for all his work in war. He was a war hero. That was the main point. And in August, on the promise that the Workers' Weekly would rescind their open letter and an apology, Campbell was released. Now, that might not sound exciting, but the Tories and the Liberals said, hey, you're letting the communists go. You know, why have you done it? And what happened? I can go through all the details, but MacDonald says, I know naught about it. I wasn't informed. Well, you'll see that, here we are. MacDonald denied having anything to do. But this is Thomas Jones, again, assistant. He's in the cabinet, he's there. I raised the issue with him on the 7th of August. He knows. That had gone beyond the truth. He was lying. Another figures in government, we've got Hankey at the top said it was all a bloody lie. Threats, and threatened to reveal what had gone on and so forth. So there's a lot of scandal going around there. So this sort of issue as the background, and it's botched in many respects. And of course, on the 8th of October, that's one of the other motions of the House of Commons that goes against the government. Now, so there's 2 prosecutions. So that is not a very good atmosphere to be in. But in addition to that, there was scandal going around about MacDonald. I could go through all sorts of quotes there, but the main problem was that there's a chap called Grant in charge of the, I think it's McVitie's Biscuits, one of the biscuit firms. And he gave MacDonald 30,000 shares in the biscuit company and a deal. So when you've got all this going on against, what's going on in Russia, what's going on with Campbell, when MacDonald comes to make speeches in the House of Commons, all the Tories are whispering, biscuits, biscuits. So we've got, at least a scandal of lack of confidence, but also a rejection of policies, and so forth. So really, in a sense, this all came together on the 8th of October and led to the calling of a general election, which was where a silly little issue like Campbell, why we for? And we go through again, Clines, this is a pretext because Labour was doing too well. Snowden, it was MacDonald's fault. I'll figure out everything there. MacDonald, Snowden can explain, and MacDonald were never very close. They were both in the same area. They weren't trade unionists. They came from a liberal background, more bureaucratic background. And basically, I suppose Philip Snowden always felt that he should be Prime Minister, or he should be the leader of the Labour Party. It's never going to happen. So really, in a sense, Labour goes out of office. And I was talking to Andrew Thorpe the other week, very much on the issue of Snowden. There was a conference at Keighley, and a book, one of his books, is an autobiography being the issue. And he argued, and he made the same point. A timely opportunity to leave office. MacDonald, wanted that. And looking at other sources, people like John Beckett. I don't know if anybody has come across Francis Beckett. Francis Beckett is his son or his grandson? I think he's his son, actually. This is a bit of an age. Now, John Beckett was a leading figure in the Labour movement, who later on joined the fascists and never got back to the Labour movement. But his diaries, which are unpublished, are still in the People's History Museum in Manchester. And he talked about MacDonald because he was a close friend, looking tired and lacking willingness to continue. But then, of course, I've got other people like Lord Beaverbrook, who wrote in the Sunday Express the article, Who Killed Count Robin? And he argues that, come on, the Labour government is a minority government. It can fall at any time. Once the Conservatives and Liberals get together, they'll get rid of it. There's no problem. I've got to say that by and large, I think that's the case. But MacDonald had not been willing to budge on the issues of Soviet treaties and whatever, or even on the Campbell case. I think it was Asquith who said, Baldwin, who said that he wouldn't push the issue of the Campbell case for a motion in the House of Commons, but MacDonald insisted he wouldn't budge and that he would have to defeat him, and so forth. So we had an election in October 1924. It was a bitter election, Labour defending its record, limited as it was. The Conservatives highlighting Soviet treaties, the Liberals highlighting Soviet treaties, etc. And basically, what happened is that in that election, actually, I mean, it was the most important, or the event that drew attention was the Zinoviev Letter. This letter comes into the hands of the Secret Services that pass it on to the Foreign Office, and it's a letter written by Zinoviev, allegedly, who was the man in charge of the Comintern, the Communist International. And its title was, the plot to use Labour to bring about the collapse of the of the Labour government, that the collapse of capitalism in Britain, and so forth and so forth. That was the sort of gist of it. And it was leaked and published in the Daily Mail, and many people have argued that the letter was, important in the defeat of Labour in the general election. In fact, in 1929, when Stanley Baldwin did not win the general election, there's a beautiful cartoon which has somebody rushing into an office where Mr. Baldwin is sat there. No news from Mr. Zinoviev yet. It's the comment. So, in a sense, it's that sort of thing. And the Red Letter was seen, I think, increasingly as a thing that lost Labour the election. I think it's not the case. Labour's vote actually increased by 1 million. The Conservatives' vote increased by 1 million or so. The Liberal vote plummeted. And really, the collapse of the Liberal Party was the reason why the Conservatives got in rather than Labour. Zinoviev Letter is probably of limited value. Indeed, the elections in those days took time. It took 2 or 3 days, because Labour is still in office on the 4th, 5th of November. It's not until all the results come in that you actually get, it's not like 1 to 2 days now, it's several days before it actually fills. And in fact, I do remember reading some of the correspondence of Stanley Baldwin, and Rotherham gave him the victory. And he has had that famous speech, which says, I once had cause to go to Rotherham. Indeed, I once caused to go to the railway station in Rotherham. Indeed, I once caused to go to the gents in the railway station in Rotherham. And when I got in there, it had a square seat. And above it was written, square uns don't bother 'em. There are some rum bums in Rotherham. And that was his announcement of his victory in 1924. So Labour is defeated. And in 1924, and Stanley Baldwin comes back with a Conservative government which really doesn't do a right lot. It's involved in things like the general strike. It takes it back to the gold standard, which perhaps partly causes the general strike, but anyway. And really, in a sense, the election, proxy back in power for 5 years. So there's quite a lot of discussion even then thereafter on or ever since basically, on the significance of that third element there, the Zinoviev Letter. Labour cabinet in November the 4th, I think last time they met, 1924, said it was a forgery. 1928, Stanley Baldwin's government said it's correct. It's not a forgery. Then the Labour government investigated again in 31 and said it was a forgery. In 1967, the Times did analysis and they said it was a forgery concocted by foreign spies from the Baltic. And more recently, this is how serious it's taken. Jill Bennett, on the behalf of Tony Blair, did a survey of all the evidence on it, and it's produced a book about 152 pages long. And it says it's undoubtedly a forgery. But whether it made any difference to Labour's situation, I'm not certain, to be honest. So we could go on, really, but if you think about it, the Labour government emerged because of unusual circumstances. It did little in office, and substantially, I think, it fell because of the Soviet treaty arrangements, or attempted Soviet treaties, and in addition to that, the Campbell case, and I doubt the Zinoviev letter was an important point. So, for once, I'm on the side of Lord Beaverbrook, I think, in that respect. But what one needs to ask is, in a sense, what is the significance of the Labour government in 1924? And I think the significance is that it broke the political mold. You know, that for, you know, in the past it had been a little liberal or a little Tory, basically. Now it was a little conservative or a little Labour. And in 1924, the real loser in all that election was the Liberal Party. 400 MPs in 1906. It had had 150 MPs in 1923. In 1924, it had 40. And it was really, and it's only been, it's only once, I think, they've been above that figure since, as the Liberal Democrats. And that's when the chappie, who I can have forgot his name, the one who died, the Liberal leader who died in
Charles Kennedy.
Kennedy. When Kennedy was in charge, because I talked at a Liberal conference in Harrogate. And my opening words, because I was dealing with the trade union treaty, that they were working with the treaty for trade unions. I said, well, last time the Liberals did that, they arranged that treaty to be, that arrangement to be made on the 1st of May 1926. Not a good day, because 2 days later, they got the general strike. And the whole audience sort of erupted. I've got to say, it's the only time in my life I've been carried out, not to be shot, but carried to the eating, well, to the refectory or the dining room or whatever. So I think really, in a sense, going back, I think the most important point, perhaps, is, well, I've said that, that in fact it did bring about the end of the two-party system as we knew it. Secondly, I think it raised an issue, and that is Labour tried to introduce some social policies. It's quite clear when you've got 21, by the end of the 20s, 28 million voters, just in 1928, get a flapper vote, that you've got to appeal to your electorate. It can't be a small section. And a lot of those electors are working class people. Therefore, you have to offer social reform. So it really meant two things. I think it meant the destruction of the old political arrangements and the creation of a new climate of political activity. So much so that, I mean, I'd been working on a chap called John Whitley, who became the Speaker of the House of Commons in the early 20s and into 1928. You might not have heard of him, but there used to be things like Whitley Councils. And, you know, similar organisations. He became a governor of the BBC and all sorts of things. And Whitley regarded one of his duties in 1924, he was there in about 21 to 28, and one of his duties was to civilise the working class representatives, the Labour Party. That was, you know, and, you know, it should have been a smile, because there was a theme developing when Labour got into office of rowdyism. People went and claimed the mace or were rowdy and so on. But in a sense, it changed attitudes about how you operated in Parliament, etc. But the biggest point is that it changed for a century, at least. We don't know what will happen in the future. You know, the pattern of British politics. It may change again. I mean, I was harangued by a reform person yesterday, a lady who I thought had some sense, but anyway. And she told me that at the next election, there'll be no Conservative Party of any worth, there'll be no Labour Party of any worth, it'll all be reformed. Well, I said, it's not happening for a century, love. I'll, you know, in 5 years' time, I'll see what happens. So we'll leave it there.
Keith, thank you very much for that huge